The closer I got to the barn, the more I picked up on the small sounds around me. The sound from the barn grew louder. A small whisper in the distance turned into a roaring cacophony. My head felt like it was going to spill out of my skull, but then I noticed... Welcome, horror buffs, to your ultimate destination for a heavy dose of bone-chilling encounters that will make your heart race and skin crawl uncontrollably. Are you ready for an intense rush of fear and thrill like never before? Then let's dive straight into the stories. The story was posted by My Passwords Reset Lolo on r/nosleep. I tried to expand my farm into the forest. Big mistake. I'm a 35-year-old male beef and dairy farmer. I raise cows and sell them to producers. Contrary to popular belief, I spend most of my time working the fields and taking care of the farm instead of the animals because the farm provides food for them. Oddly enough, I can't stand to eat beef. Even just seeing it makes my skin crawl. I know it sounds strange, but let me explain. I had hired some contractors to expand into the forest, and I thought it was going to be all fine. But one day my tractor broke down in the middle of a long stretch of road. It was around dusk, so I wanted to get moving as quickly as possible before the animals woke. So there I was, looking through the tractor's engine to see what had gone wrong. Turns out the serpentine belt had broken. Damn, I don't have a replacement for me. I sigh and try pulling out my phone. While twiddling with the buttons, I felt a weight on my shoulder. "Hello there, partner. I think this might be helpful." The voice was low and grainy, like someone who had just woken up. I turn around to see a flat-faced man holding a slip belt perfect for the tractor. I accept his aid and take a better look at him. However, the sun shining behind him blinds me, silhouetted like a shade blending into the darkened tree line. Word of advice. Friend. You should give up your intrusion into the forest. He begins to push past me and walk past my tractor, just outside of my view. I'm able to catch a glimpse of what he's wearing. A long, dark shawl decorated with what looks to be a million eyes. Give up before you wake the beast. Hello up, partner. Roll that back a minute. What are you talking about? I walk around the corner of the tractor to glimpse him. Nothing but still air. Later that day, I received a call that the contractors had found a small marsh of sticky black tar, filled with a number of animal skeletons. The farm has always been quiet at night. All the farmhands leave to go home, and it's just me in the barn. My part of the country doesn't have many criminals, and most steer clear of cattle farmers because there isn't much worth stealing. I jolted awake one night. I could hear the distant sound of my cows in distress, a dozen guttural cries layered on top of each other. It's hard to express what the sound was. It was an octave lower than what cattle typically sound like. I shuffled onto my feet and grabbed my shotgun. Usually, I'm not too distressed about these things. Most of the time, it's just a sickly cow passing or one of the pregnant ones giving birth. However, I never found there to be any cows in such a condition. I was worrying. What if a thief had gotten in, or worse, a bear? The closer I got to the barn, the more I picked up on the small sounds around me. The sound from the barn grew louder. A small whisper in the distance turned into a roaring cacophony. My head felt like it was going to spill out of my skull, but then I noticed something odd. The dull pitter-patter of hooves on dry ground was missing. I inched closer to the barn. My legs felt like a pair of stilts, 1,000 miles tall. My shotgun weighed down in my arms, and I could feel the cold steel of the barrel pressing into my arm as I readied to enter the barn. I adjusted it in my hand, feeling the texture of the barrel. Smooth, finely machined steel ran across its length, interrupted by pure sandpaper. I hadn't needed to take the weapon out often, so it had grown weak. I could only really shoot it twice. The hinges had rusted over a while ago, and I hadn't thought to get it maintained. I swallowed as I pushed into the barn. It felt like a mouse passing through the inside of a snake. I entered the barn quietly. I had left the door open, and a light shaft cast through the barn. The light bounced off the floor, faintly illuminating the forms of the barn from underneath. It was bright enough to make out the space vaguely. I was so caught up in my anxieties that I hadn't noticed the barn had gone quiet. "Is anyone there?" Slam. Silence. No more light except for crooked lines of moonlight slithering into the barn, jagged and broken. Dozens of unaware black eyes stared back at me. The cows were fine, some awake, others asleep, all in order. This can't be right. Where's the bear? The thief? There has to be something in here. I aimed the gun and scanned the barn from corner to corner. Pieces of hay crunched under my weight as I walked through the barn. I scanned each of the pens, cows, bulls, and calves. I felt a jitter in my spine. Usually one or two would swing their tail or eat a bale of hay, but they sat there ghost still, posed as if ready for a picture. A shadow passed through the gaps of light. "I'm armed, and I will shoot if you don't give up peacefully." Still nothing. I could hear the fluid in my ears sloshing around. The cold air was stagnant. My face stung from the chill, and my nose picked up on something. A bitter smell, almost like rotting meat. I inched closer to the smell. Scuttling. 1,000 hooves on the hardwood. A shadow shifted through the forms. The guttural screaming of 1,000 cows began once more. The cattle were still stiff, almost like they couldn't hear it. Distorted and low, snorting and growling, it was the war cry of a great army bearing down on me. I inched away, my gun ready. I was prepared to shoot. A long shadow cut through the splintered light. The silhouette of a great bull cast itself on the wall of the barn. "Leave!" A low growl echoed in my skull, sounding like it passed through thin metal. My gut twisted into a knot, and the walls felt like they shot out in odd angles, pitching and rotating with wild abandon. It was like the barn was melting around me. My fingers twitched. Bang. The many horned heads turned up at attention. Madness. The cattle were running into the walls, injuring each other in the chaos, however. They were trapped in their pens. My head was about to pop off, and the world was closing in. Madness. Sheer cacophony. I leaned against the wall and looked forward. A form emerged from the shrieking mass. It was approaching. As it got closer, I flinched instinctively. 2 piercing red eyes were looking back at me, white-hot anger. The shotgun weighed 1,000 pounds. I shifted its weight, gasping as I tried to keep my arms straight. Bang! The barrel was aimed directly at it, still approaching. Click, click, click. What the... oh no. My legs toppled. I tried to pull myself up, but they won't work. I felt a warm, wet breath on my face. It was inches away from me. Cud curdled in my throat. The smell of pure sulfur violated my nose, and before I could react, I was hurled backward, landing hard in the dirt with a mouthful of grass. Dazed, I looked up to see the barn looming over me from the outside. I had no room to question the voice. Whatever thing could do those things wasn't human, nor was it an animal. And I wanted no part of it. I sold the farm that same month and moved into the city to work as a gardener. Agriculture skills are surprisingly transferable to gardening. I don't miss the farm. But sometimes, when driving through the countryside late at night, I swear I see a pair of red eyes glowing in the distance, watching, waiting. Let's now move on to the next story from Society's Menace CC. I am a researcher of the Titanic. A recently discovered artifact has left me traumatized. I've spent my entire professional life studying the Titanic, but nothing could have prepared me for how deeply the ship would eventually consume me. My name is Dr. Michael Hartley, and I'm a maritime historian specializing in the RMS Titanic. For 20 years, I've dedicated my life to understanding every minute detail of that tragic voyage. The passengers, the crew, the intricate social dynamics, the fatal design flaws. What began as academic fascination gradually transformed into an obsession that would ultimately unravel my entire perception of reality. The artifact came from a private collection in Southampton. An elderly collector, Harold Jameson, had contacted me after hearing about my reputation. He claimed to have something unusual, personal effects, recovered from the wreckage that had never been properly documented. Most researchers would have been skeptical, but my hunger for untold stories always outweighed my caution. When the package arrived, it was surprisingly modest. A small leather satchel, water-stained and fragile, contained what appeared to be personal documents, a tarnished locket, and a small fragment of fabric. The moment my fingers brushed against the items, something felt different. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The fabric was what caught my attention first. A small, roughly triangular piece of third-class passenger clothing. Coarse, dark wool with intricate stitching. As I examined it under my magnifying glass, the edge unexpectedly caught my skin. A thin, precise cut opened across my palm. Tiny droplets of blood immediately welling up. I should have cleaned the wound immediately. I should have been more careful. But something about the artifact held me transfixed. The blood seemed to absorb into the fabric. Not seep, not stain, but absorb, like the material was drinking it. For a split second, I could have sworn the fabric's color deepened, becoming richer, more vibrant. That was the first moment I heard the whispers, faint at first. So quiet, I initially thought it was the wind or the ambient noise of my study. Fragmented words in a language that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. Desperate, terrified. No escape, water rising. God help me. I dismissed it as imagination. Exhaustion from weeks of intense research. But as the days progressed, the whispers became more persistent, more defined. By the third night, I knew something fundamental had changed. The dreams began. Vivid, horrifyingly detailed nightmares that felt less like dreams and more like memories. I wasn't just observing, I was experiencing. I was Thomas Riley, a 22-year-old Irish immigrant from a small village outside Dublin, third-class passenger, dreaming of a better life in America, scraped together every penny for that ticket on the Titanic. In these dreams, these memories, I could feel the cramped conditions of steerage, the smell of unwashed bodies, the constant background noise of children crying, adults speaking in a dozen different languages, the hope, the desperation, and then the ice. The first impact was nothing like the dramatic Hollywood depictions. A subtle shudder. Most passengers didn't even realize something was wrong. But Thomas knew. Something in his bones understood the terrible mathematics of what was happening. Water, cold, rising, panic would come later. First would be the terrible, suffocating realization of doom. Each night, the dreams grew more intense, more real. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my lungs burning, convinced I was drowning. My sheets would be damp, smelling of salt and industrial coal smoke. Something was happening to me, something I couldn't explain. The cut on my hand didn't heal properly. What began as a simple wound transformed into something different. The skin around the cut remained perpetually raw, with an iridescent quality that shifted colors when caught in certain light. Blues and grays, like deep ocean water. Sometimes, if I stared too long, I could swear the wound moved, not visibly, but with a subtle, internal rippling. My research became increasingly erratic. Colleagues noticed the change. Dr. Elizabeth Moreau, my longtime research partner, approached me during a conference. Her concern etched deep in the lines of her face. "Michael, you look terrible," she said, not unkindly. "When was the last time you slept?" I couldn't tell her about the dreams, about Thomas, about the memories that weren't mine. The artifacts from the Southampton collection began to consume my every waking moment. I cataloged them obsessively, discovering minute details that had escaped previous researchers. A ticket stub with a partial fingerprint. A fragment of a letter, water-damaged but still partially legible. A brass button from a third-class steward's uniform. Each item seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. The whispers grew stronger. During the day, they were subtle. Background noise that could be mistaken for the hum of fluorescent lights or the distant murmur of traffic. But at night, they became a symphony of terror. Hundreds of voices, overlapping, desperate. The water, can't breathe, too cold. I started keeping a journal. Not for academic purposes, but as a desperate attempt to maintain my sanity, to track the progression of whatever was happening to me. Entry, October 17th. The dreams are becoming more specific. I'm not just experiencing Thomas's memories. I'm beginning to understand his entire life. His hopes, his fears, the smell of his mother's bread, the calluses on his hands from working the fields, the weight of his single best suit, purchased specifically for the journey to America. I know the exact moment he realized the ship was doomed. It wasn't a sudden revelation, not a dramatic moment of terror, just a slow, terrible understanding that crept into his consciousness like ice-cold water. The cut on my hand started to change. Small, intricate patterns began to emerge around the wound. Patterns that looked like nautical maps, like the complex network of corridors inside the Titanic. Thin, blue-gray lines that seemed to move when I wasn't directly looking at them. My sleep became a battlefield. One moment, I was Dr. Michael Hartley, respected historian, meticulous researcher. The next, I was Thomas Riley, poor, desperate, trapped. The boundary between us was dissolving, and something else was emerging, something that had been waiting. Buried deep beneath the cold Atlantic waters for over a century, something that wanted to be remembered. By November, I was losing myself. My apartment became a sprawling archive of Titanic ephemera, walls covered in maritime maps, passenger lists, and photographs. But these weren't just historical documents anymore. They were alive. The photographs. God. The photographs. Third-class passengers frozen in sepia-toned moments would shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Faces would turn slightly. Eyes would follow me. Not all of them, just select images. Always the ones showing people who would die that night. Thomas's memories were no longer confined to dreams. I could taste the salt water during faculty meetings, feel the impossible cold of the Atlantic while lecturing about maritime engineering. Sometimes, mid-sentence, I would forget who I was. Was I the professor, or the desperate young immigrant clutching a wooden panel in freezing water? The wound on my hand had become a map, literally. Intricate blue-gray lines now formed a precise topographical representation of the Titanic's lower decks. If I traced the lines with my finger, I could feel the ship's internal layout, could sense the exact location of each corridor, each compartment, the precise angles where water would first breach the hull. Dr. Moreau stopped calling. My department chair suggested a sabbatical. I was becoming something else, something between historian and haunting. One night, I discovered something in Thomas's memories that chilled me more than the phantom maritime cold that now perpetually surrounded me. He wasn't supposed to be on that ship. His original ticket for a smaller vessel leaving a week earlier had been lost. Stolen, actually, by a man whose name was never recorded in any manifest. A man whose face Thomas remembered with a strange, specific terror. A man who seemed to know what was coming. The whispers grew more insistent, no longer just memories of terror and drowning. Now they carried something else. A warning. He is coming. He has always been coming. I realized then that the haunting wasn't about the ship. It was about something much older, much darker, and I was just beginning to understand. Christmas came, and with it, a strange peace. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed. Thomas's memories became less a torment and more a companionship. I understood now that he wasn't trying to possess me. He was trying to warn me. Dr. Elizabeth Moreau visited me on Christmas Eve. I hadn't seen her in months, and the concern in her eyes told me I looked as fractured as I felt. "I brought you something," she said, placing an old leather-bound journal on my desk. It was my grandmother's. She was a maritime historian, too. I thought you might appreciate it. The journal belonged to a researcher from the 1930s, someone who had been investigating the Titanic long before modern technology made such research easier. As Elizabeth left, I opened the pages. Tucked between yellowed sheets was a photograph. Not of the Titanic, not of any passenger. A man, standing alone on a foggy pier, his face partially obscured but familiar in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. The man from Thomas's stolen memory. That night, the wound on my hand, now a living map of maritime tragedy, began to speak differently. No longer desperate whispers of drowning, but something more measured, more intentional. Some stories are meant to be remembered. Some warnings must be carried. I understood then that Thomas's spirit wasn't a victim. He was a guardian. The cold that had haunted me for months began to recede, not completely, but enough that I could breathe, enough that I could think clearly. Outside my window, snow fell, pure, silent, and for the first time since touching that artifact, I felt something like hope. The story wasn't over, but I was no longer afraid, at least not completely. Let's now move on to the third story for this video from one bitter student. I loved my father, but he came back. I always believed we needed to let go of the ones we've lost, no matter how much it hurts. But no one warned me what to do if they came back. How grief, pain, and sorrow, things I was so sure were real, could suddenly feel like lies. I was 7 when he died. Back then, I never truly understood how much his presence meant to me. The memory of his last days still haunts me. The antiseptic hospital smell, the hushed murmurs of passing nurses, and his last words, perfectly clear despite his weakness. "Take care of your mother for me, buddy." After they took him away, I found Mom on her knees in the hallway after the doctors spoke to her. I remember thinking how strange it was to see an adult break that way. Life blurred after his death. Mom crumbled, and I learned to raise myself. Cooking, homework, childhood crises. Some nights, I'd find her in Dad's armchair, still in work clothes, staring at his photo. She'd kiss me back to bed, her tears marking my forehead despite her mumbled excuses about dust. Growing up without him was difficult, but we managed. The years passed and we settled into our routine. I kept his memory alive in small ways, wearing his broken watch, using his old things. Mom said grief does that, though she never explained why. Maybe we're both still figuring it out. As I got older, the memories of him began to fade. His eyes, I couldn't remember if they were brown or hazel. Mom kept his photos, but somehow they never seemed to capture him in the right light. I held on to them as a reminder. Then came that day in my sophomore year when everything changed. Walking home that crisp autumn day, a familiar scent stopped me. Applewood smoke, though no one on our street had a working fireplace anymore. At the corner, our house looked wrong. Time seemed to have reversed itself. Dad's bluebells swayed in the dead garden, spring flowers in autumn, and his wind chimes sang without wind. The scent hit me as I opened the front door. Fresh coffee and pancakes. We hadn't had coffee made here in years. From the living room came a sound I'd almost forgotten. Mom's genuine laughter, accompanied by a deeper voice that made my heart stutter. The hallway stretched endlessly. Dad's cardigan hung on the banister, warm to touch. His crossword puzzle lay unfinished, the pen still warm, his shoes exactly where he always left them. Each detail clicked into place with terrifying precision. In the living room, Mom curled against him on the couch. There sat my father, impossibly real, reading glasses perched on his nose, that untamable eyebrow, even the coffee stain Mom always scolded him about. "Welcome home, buddy," he said. Mom beamed beside him, her hand in his, looking younger than she had in years. The weight of grief seemed to have melted away. She looked at him the way she used to, the way I'd almost forgotten, like he was her entire world. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice shaking not from terror, but from the weight of what I was seeing. He smiled at me with that slightly crooked incisor he'd chipped playing baseball when he was 12. "I missed you so much," he said, his voice catching slightly, exactly the way it used to when he was trying not to cry. Mom announced dinner was ready, casual as anything. The smell of his favorite meatloaf drifted from the kitchen, the recipe his mother had passed down, the one Mom had never quite mastered in all the years since. But now it smelled perfect. I couldn't move, because I remembered holding my father's cold hand at the funeral. I remembered watching them lower his casket into the ground. I remembered 9 years of grieving, of missing him, of learning to live without him. And here he was. Impossible, but real. I backed into the door. "How are you here?" My voice cracked. Dad's face shifted to that familiar, concerned expression as he stepped forward, hands open, exactly how he'd approach my childhood tantrums. "What's wrong, buddy?" His voice held that perfect mix of worry and love I'd fought to remember. Mom appeared, wiping her hands on her anniversary apron, the one that should have been yellowed with age but looked brand new. I kept my distance, the door my anchor to reality. Everything felt real. That was the problem. I looked at my mother, really looked at her. She looked happy, genuinely, completely happy, in a way I hadn't seen since before the hospital. I wanted to run, to escape. Yet, I couldn't leave her here with whatever this was. Even if it felt like Dad, even if it smiled like him and moved like him and remembered everything exactly right. I lunged forward and grabbed her hand. "Mom, we have to go," I said, pulling her toward the door. She resisted, her eyes filling with tears. "Honey, what's gotten into you?" Her voice broke, just like it used to when I disappointed her. "Why are you trying to ruin this? We're finally whole again." I dragged her outside, past the garden where those impossible bluebells bloomed. The street was empty except for the glow from neighbors' windows. Mom fought against me, repeating, "It's okay," over and over. When I looked back, my father, or whatever wore his face, stood in our doorway, watching us with that familiar hurt expression. "Mom, please," I begged. "He died. You remember the funeral? You remember everything after." But my words faltered as she looked at me with genuine confusion. "What are you talking about? Your father's right there. He's always been here." She touched my forehead like checking for a fever. "Are you feeling okay? You've been working so hard at school lately." "No. He's dead. Mom, he's dead." The words felt less certain now, seeing him there in the doorway, looking exactly as a father should when worried about his child. Everything I remembered about the funeral seemed to blur, like a dream fading in the morning light. His footsteps on the path carried that familiar unevenness from his old injury. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home. Whatever's bothering you, we can figure it out together. We always do." I felt something in my mind shift as his footsteps drew closer. Slowly, each memory of my father began adjusting to accept this new reality. "Son," he said, and his voice carried all the warmth I'd been missing for 9 years. "He's dead," I whispered, but even as I said it, I noticed Mom's expression. Patient, waiting, like she knew exactly what I was going through, like she'd made this choice before. But I couldn't accept this. I wouldn't disrespect my father's memory, the hardship we'd faced, the pain we'd endured. "Please, Mom, wake up. This isn't real," I said as I tried to pull her, but this time I couldn't move. No, the truth was, I wouldn't move. My body betraying me. "Your father's been worried about you," she said softly. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, Just a moment. I saw everything there. Understanding, grief, choice. Sometimes, she added carefully, happiness is right in front of us, if we just let it be. He was closer now, and I could smell his aftershave, the same brand I'd kept unopened in my drawer for years. Yet the memory felt uncertain now, like trying to hold on to water. I tried to remember the funeral, but the images kept shifting, then fading. Do you remember how he used to push you on the swings? Mom asked, her voice gentle. How he never pushed too high because you were scared of heights? Every Sunday, Dad added, and suddenly I could see it clearly, the creak of the swing set, his hands steady on my back, my laughter carrying across the yard. Had that happened before or after? Did it matter anymore? I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't perfect. There were new wrinkles around his eyes that my memories hadn't included. His hair was slightly grayer than in the photos. He looked lived in, real, like he'd been aging alongside us all this time. Dad? I said again, but this time it wasn't a question born of fear. Something in my mind whispered that this was wrong, that there was another set of memories trying to claim space. Cold hands, a casket, years of absence. But those memories felt distant now, like a dream I'd once had. This felt real. His smile, Mom's hand in mine, the smell of dinner waiting at home. Come on, buddy, he said, holding out his hand. Your mom's lasagna is getting cold. I looked at Mom one last time. There was something in her eyes. Knowledge, maybe, or understanding. A tiny nod, so slight I might have imagined it, a choice being offered. I took his hand. It was warm. That night my reflection caught my eye. Something questioning in my gaze. Then Dad called about tomorrow's fishing trip, the one we'd planned for weeks. The one we'd always done every year, forever. And I let the doubt slip away. After all, why question happiness? Dad's home. He's always been home. And if sometimes, late at night, I remember another life, well, that's just a bad dream. Mom says they fade, don't they? If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more thrilling horror stories like these. Also, share your thoughts on the story in the comment section below. If you want me to feature your own story on this channel, you are most welcome. Send your story to the email provided in the description below.